We really appreciate you joining us. We know everyone's really busy, so great that you've chosen to spend a bit of time with us. So the we is myself, and James Lamb, and I'm a lecturer in digital education here at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm especially interested in the way that learning spaces are affected by digital technologies. We also have Dr. Joe Noteboom here, and Joe's a former hybrid teaching assistant and now works as a senior learning technology and design advisor at the EFI. And then we have my colleague here, Professor Jen Ross, and Jen's introduction reads, Jen has been teaching online since 2009 and in hybrid mode since 2021. She has seen things. So we're your presenters today, and we're going to be presenting on a piece of work that was published earlier this year that we co-authored with one of our former colleagues, Tim Fawns, who now works at Monash University. And what we are going to do in this session is we're going to talk about hybrid education, and we're going to talk about how we think, based upon our experiences, we can confront the complexities of hybrid education by drawing on some of the principles and ideas from dance choreography. Now, none of us are dancers. Well, I don't know about Jen and Joe. I haven't seen them dancing especially, but no, we're getting some serious shaking of heads here. We certainly wouldn't position ourselves as experts in dance, either as performers or as researchers in this field, but we found it really productive to draw on some of the ideas from dance. So we're going to talk about that. We're not expecting a fire alarm today, so therefore, if there is a fire alarm in this building, we will exit through that door there. We are recording the main session, but we won't be recording the questions. We're going to aim to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll hand over for questions. But we will be monitoring the chat as we go along, so if you've got comments or questions, please feel free to put those in the chat, and we can discuss them later in the session. But the first thing we need to do is to take a position on hybrid education, because as Jen is going to come on and discuss, it accommodates a range of different interpretations and practices. So for the purposes of today's session, we are seeing hybrid education as activities that simultaneously happen online and within a physical space. Hybrid is about the forging of connections between online and in-room groups and spaces. And we start as designers from a position, some curious interference there. We start from a position that hybrid is not about making in-room teaching available to an online audience. It's about starting from a position of working to combine, to fuse these different modes. And I think a really important principle for us is hybrid is not about making in-room activity available. It isn't enough to settle for making materials available or people being able to attend. It's about really trying to design high quality experiences by fusing together these two different modes. That, however, is not always straightforward. And one way of thinking about hybrid is all of the things that can go wrong in a physical classroom and all of the things that can go wrong with online learning, you have combined together. So there are complexities as well as the potentialities, which Jen's going to talk about in a few moments. But to confront this complexity, we found ideas from dance choreography really helpful. And as Jen and Tim and Joe and I reflected on our experiences, we've been teaching since, I think, 2021, doing this kind of work. We reflected on our experiences. We found that choreography and improvisation captured a lot of what we did to try and produce high quality teaching experiences in the hybrid mode. And as we looked further into the research and writing around dance choreography, we found there were more and more examples of how we could productively bring dance together with hybrid. Things like patterns of movement, rules and constraints, the possibilities of accidents. And so that is what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm going to hand over to Jen now, who's going to talk a little bit more about the nature of hybrid, because it is a term that supports different interpretations, but also bearing in mind its complexities, why we think it's worth investing our time in it.
Thanks, James. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see everyone online and in the room. We're really happy to be here and have a chance to talk about this stuff today, especially because there's a lot of people here, and I mean here very broadly, who know a lot about this. So we're definitely going to leave time for conversation and discussion at the end. So I wanted to spend a few minutes saying something about why we bother, right? Why should we invest the amount of kind of time and effort and thought that's gone into making hybrid education work in the particular setting that we're most familiar with. And to do that, I wanted to first of all say, when people start giving multiple names to the same thing, that you're seeing some kind of digital education thing happening, right? So I was very entertained to find that Beatty in 2019 is credited for the popular HyFlex model, which is more or less what we're talking about when we talk about hybrid or fusion. But this builds on learner choice, accessibility, equivalency, and reusability. And these four places have inspired multiple variations of HyFlex, including StudyFlex, BlendFlex, interactive synchronous HyFlex, here or there instruction, which I want to know more about that. That sounds cool because it's hot. And remote live participation. So this is the territory, right? And depending on where you come at it from, you're likely to encounter a different set of readings and resources that are helping you think through these issues. But I think that what we often don't get in this literature is a really compelling case for why we're doing
There we go.
How's that? Yeah? I'm going to just say something and see if it's working. Thank you so much. Thanks for letting us know. So there are just under 3 million students in higher education in the UK, and that was 23-24, which is when the last stats were released for this year from Gov UK, and 25% of those are studying a master's or other postgraduate course. The majority of postgraduate students are studying part-time, and the full-time market is predominantly made up of international students. So those are facts 1 and 2. Facts 3 and 4. The proportion of students aged 30 and over enrolled in first degree courses has increased over the past 5 years, rising from 11% to 15%. Fact 4, after steadily increasing over the past 2 decades, the participation rate in England, the proportion of young people choosing to go to higher education, has gone into reverse in the past 2 years. So there's a whole bunch of different things going on in terms of who's participating in higher education, what that participation looks like. And for us, what this means is we're seeing a real need not to invest or think about just one kind of student, one mode of study, but different ways that different students might be needing to come to us and how we can attract new groups of students to come as well. So we need to find ways to attract and serve older students and drive participation rates among younger people. We need to serve both part-time and full-time students. And the notion of a multifaceted student population is, I think, where we're at the moment in terms of the way we need to be thinking about what's going on in higher education and what might be happening soon. So there's lots of reasons why organizationally and pedagogically there are some benefits to hybrid education. It can reach out to a greater base of potential students, offer more elective and specific courses, involve external experts more easily, eliminate the need to teach the same course twice to different classes, provide flexibility in course attendance for students, and there's that multifaceted student population there, and strengthen students' willingness and ability to make contacts all over the world by fostering collaboration and connection. This is just a few of the examples from this particular paper, and there's lots more as well. But I think there are pedagogical and ethical and also strategic reasons why hybrid is important as well. First of all, we need to not lose sight of the fact that there's a certain level of uncertainty about the kinds of things that may face us. We need to be prepared for different kinds of disruptions, as the COVID-19 pandemic taught us. And we also, and this is Rikke Norgaard, who's made this case about lifelong learning and hybrid education, we need to develop and continually develop new possibilities for lifelong learning. We cannot think about higher education as just for people who can attend full-time in person on the campus. We should never have thought about it like that, but we definitely can't think about it like that now. And we can't think about these sorts of seamless higher education experiences as the norm anymore. And so this is where the idea of hybrid education and the possibilities of different kinds of experimentations with hybrid really are absolutely vital to the future of higher education. And so that's why we should. I'm going to hand over to Joe now to say why it's complicated.
Yes, thanks, Jen. Yeah, so these are the sorts of considerations that informed the development of hybrid teaching at the Edinburgh Futures Institute. We have a suite of master's programs that are taught in hybrid mode at the moment, where on-site students and online students are taught together as a single cohort. Courses combine asynchronous online learning with synchronous intensive sessions. And the courses are all interdisciplinary and challenge-led, so highly interactive, highly kind of participatory, which brings, challenges in interacting between modes. And during synchronous sessions, as we've kind of highlighted in the paper, lecturers work with teaching assistants to manage the hybrid classroom and to teach in this mode. So we've got multiple cameras, microphones. For those of you in the room, you can see this firsthand. Different devices, as well as a Teams meeting and the chat, breakout rooms, things like that, and other sorts of platforms that are commonly used. So collaborative whiteboards, coding notebooks, things like that. And just to give you a little sense of what it looks like from the teaching desk, those online can see this picture here. This is actually a slightly simpler version of the desk that I'm at right now, but you've got multiple monitors, you've got different cameras in the room, so you can switch between different camera angles. I'll give you a little dizzying sense of what that looks like in practice. We've also got an audience camera, so you can see the folks in the room, and then we've got tables spread out throughout the room with Teams devices, microphones, cameras, screens. So there's all sorts of equipment that needs to kind of work together to make this work in practice. And it's very kind of complex, lots of moving parts that need to be configured and managed by the lecturer and the teaching assistant. And this poses challenges. So in my work as a learning technologist, building on my work as a teaching assistant, I've worked with lecturers across the Institute. I've trained lecturers and teaching assistants. And I've come to appreciate that there are a number of kind of technological, pedagogical, and organizational challenges to making this work. And just to be clear, these aren't kind of discrete categories. They're definitely overlapping, and I don't think of them separately, but just to make it a bit clearer. So technologically, we're highly dependent on network digital infrastructure, which can be prone to, as we've seen already today, can be prone to little glitches, malfunctions, unexpected changes. We've had to deal with software updates, firmware updates coming from San Francisco or wherever that changed the way things work in the classroom, and we've had to adapt to that on the fly. This mode is also quite demanding of teachers as well as students. So there's a kind of steep learning curve to mastering all this technology. There's a lot to get your head around, a lot to manage on the day, and it's a learning experience that requires training and experience, as we'll get into a little bit later. Pedagogically, teaching in hybrid, I found, requires the adaptation of the kind of taken for granted typical classroom practices. So for people used to teaching in person, just things like writing on a whiteboard, or having students raise their hand and chime in a class discussion, or walking around when you're lecturing need to be kind of rethought and adapted because everything needs to be audible and visible in the Teams meeting. And there are lots of challenges to student participation and inclusion involving online students in out-of-classroom activities like field trips or kind of making activities, things like that, poses challenges. And we're also dealing with diverse needs of online students. So students online and on-site students. So students have very different life circumstances. Sometimes they're working in different time zones, and this all poses challenges that need to be accounted for in courses. Organizationally, I think one of the big challenges we deal with is that teaching staff have limited time for training and preparation. Everyone's really busy, everyone's overworked. The incentives of kind of academic life don't always support teaching innovation or kind of engagement in this sort of work. So not everyone has the kind of time or the inclination to attend the training sessions and to really, it takes time to make this work, and everyone is a bit pressed for time. And then the other big thing is that this on-site, online distinction we've found is really hardwired into institutional systems and policies. So things like student information system need students to be either on-site or online. Visa regulations for students on a student visa aren't able to attend online. So all these kind of institutional, structures sometimes work against the potential benefits of hybrid. So this is what we're dealing with, and this is what we're hoping to help think through today with this lens, which I think James is going to continue.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So hopefully what's coming over is obviously the complexity of hybrid. But before we go on and talk about how we can confront this complexity through approaches from dance choreography, I suppose one difference between hybrid and dance choreography, and there are other examples that we'll come on to, is that dance choreography tends to understandably privilege the human body. And what we have tended to see, and what Joe's actually really nicely described there, is that we would instead see that hybrid as, of course, still having a strong interest in the interest and actions of the teacher, the teaching assistant, and the student, but contingent always with a wide range of different social and material elements. So we've found it really helpful in our work to draw on work around the socio-materiality of education, for instance, by Fennick et al., just to recognize that, yes, when we're teaching in a hybrid setting like this, it is about human bodies, of course it is, but it's also about technology. It's about the physical arrangement of the space. It's about sound, about microphones. But it's also about invisible actors as well. It's about the procurement policies that influence the technologies that we have. It's about university strategy. It's about wider political issues, strategic issues that Jen was talking about earlier. And so we found it really helpful to combine the socio-materiality of education with hybrid and our thinking around dance choreography as well. And so now what we're going to try and do is we're going to run through 5 different vignettes which help to take a hopefully more practical approach to show how we did this within our own teaching. And so the first example I'm going to talk about is drawing on the ideas of rules and constraints within dance choreography. And anyone who has ever attended an online session, whether in a meeting or a conference or in teaching, knows how at times it can be very othering. For instance, you switch on at midday to see lots of people chatting in the room, and then there'll be a message in chat saying, we'll begin in 5 minutes once everyone in the room's got tea or coffee. And it can be very othering. Everyone will have been in a situation where you've been in an online meeting and you were dutifully raising with your hand, standing with your, or sitting with your hand raised in Teams or Zoom, waiting to ask a question while conversation in the room just bounces between people. And then someone will eventually say, oh, it turns out we've got a question online. We actively try to avoid that in our teaching because we feel that can be very othering for the online student. To reiterate the point we said before, it's about fusing 2 modes together. It's not trying to make what's happened here available for people to see online. That isn't fusion, okay, from our point of view. And one way that I've approached this, and that Joe and I enacted in our early instances of one of the courses, was imposing rules and constraints on what can happen in room in order to create greater equity of experience. And so to show how this would kind of manifest in practice, when I'm doing a lecture session in hybrid teaching, students in room can't raise their hand to ask a question. Students can't just jump in to the dialogue, because for the most part, those are opportunities that are not afforded to the online student. So in all of our classes, students are required to come to class with a laptop or equivalent device. Where they don't have these resources, EFI provides them and makes them available. And when a student comes to the class, the in-room student, I require them to join the online Teams meeting. And that does a number of things. First of all, it means that students are straight away connecting with each other. So we get people chatting. I encourage people whilst I'm speaking to be having a dialogue in chat. So the in-room and the online students are speaking and raising questions during the session itself. When it comes to questions, everyone has to raise their hand through Teams. And the teaching assistant in the room, so in that case it was in Joe in the first instances of the course, Joe is able to see who raises their hand first and to bring people in to the conversation. And so what we're trying to do there is put a limit on the normal behaviors you would have in the physical classroom in order to create links between the two spaces and the two groups of students, but to also avoid a kind of natural deprivileging of those who are not in the physical space. So through rules and constraints, what we're trying to do is reduce the natural advantage of the student who is in close physical proximity to the lecturer or the teacher. So that's the first of our examples, rules and constraints.
Thanks, James. Sorry, I've got my...
I'll take it back off you then.
So the second story that we want to tell is about the importance, the meaning of rehearsal in the context of hybrid teaching. So I really love this quote from Wisner about the way knowledge of the dance is embodied in doing the dance. There's only one way to really know in the context of dance and choreography, and that is to do, and not just do once, but do repeatedly. And so they say that the reassertion of the body as a source of knowledge is a strong critique of a traditional devaluing of practical knowing. And for us, this is incredibly important for people who are beginning to teach in fusion mode. And actually, because things change and the rooms, you end up in different rooms, and the whole thing kind of is a slightly movable feast. It's not only when you're starting out that you need these kinds of rehearsals. For us, this kind of choreography was not just about the technology and which buttons to press, but also the kinds of movements and locations in the room that made sense to be in, how sight lines, microphones, and other elements of the teaching space worked towards the enactment of hybrid teaching. So this is such an old photograph that this is before the opening of this wonderful building that we are physically based in today. This was our space that we had and before we could come into this building, because this building was still being built. And this shows a number of teachers, including Tim and myself and James and learning technology colleagues. And we are trying to get to grips with what you now see around you as the kind of traditional EFI teaching space. We spent a long time on this particular day, but on other days as well, trying different things out, seeing what it was like to be online, seeing what it was like to be in the room, standing in different locations, trying to kind of feel and understand what it was going to be like to teach in this space. I was just thinking, I think at one point there was a bit of tape on the floor in that room that indicated where you should stay behind if you wanted to be visible to the cameras in that room for people to be able to see you from online. And these kinds of material sort of objects and the spaces that we were operating in were a chance to kind of rehearse and to really know that space before we were doing it live. And it was really important and quite quite valuable and sometimes a bit stressful. Yep, back over to James.
Okay, following on nicely from Jen's point there about whether we had a mark on the floor. I've done that. I've actually put little bits of tape so I know where to stand. So if you imagine, like in performance, there would be little bits of tape on the stage. I've done exactly the same because it's so easy, I think, in a hybrid setting. You talked about this before, Joe. You know, your natural instinct when you're teaching is you walk away from the camera, you want to walk into the audience. But if you do that straight away, you become less visible to the online members of the group. And so patterns of movement is an important part of dance choreography. And obviously, we are not presenting ourselves as professional dance choreographers. But again, it's an idea that is useful in terms of conceptualizing how we approach our hybrid teaching. And so I've mentioned already that within hybrid, there's probably more of an emphasis on the relationship between the human body and some of the material elements. And that's not to say that within dance choreography, that isn't also important. There's obviously space, there's light, there's costume, but it's extended within the hybrid setting through digital technologies, among other things. And so what I've done, and some of my colleagues will laugh at this, the level of detail I will go to ahead of doing hybrid teaching. But I put together 2 documents ahead of each time I do hybrid teaching. So the one on the left is like a script, a schedule. It's intended to be small because I'm not desperate for everyone to see some of the things that I write down, but this is a document I put together to share with colleagues. And if you look really close, you might see some of the names involved with colleagues. Yu Miao was the teaching assistant for the course in this instance. And there are notes in there for Yu Miao and I at different points in a teaching session to physically move to a different part of the room, to rearrange the furniture. There are notes there for Yu Miao to almost in the way of like a stage director or a film director, because she's in the room, but she's following as an online student on screen to tell me when I'm not audible, to tell me to move back into the view of the different camera. And that's augmented by creating a schematic of the room as well. So we can decide how within the course of a half-day session, we want to use the physical space in different ways. And so for me, this is really helpful in terms of helping me think through what hybrid will look like. But the written document is also really helpful as a checklist as we go through the session, because when you're trying to simultaneously engage with online students and students who are in the room, you've got NASA mission control technologies in front of you. There's a lot to contend with. So having something as simple as, you know, an analog printout that tells me where I need to be at a particular time in the session is really, really helpful. So we found that approach to kind of patterns very helpful, but it's patterns of movement through the space and our relationship with objects, but it's also from a sociomateriality perspective, sociomaterial perspective. It's also thinking about patterns of technology and objects and human interests and teaching and beyond. Now we have the intriguing message of the possibilities of accidents.
Yeah. Because we all know, for all that we do to prepare, to practice, to rehearse, to plan, things happen. They do. And this is one of the things that I find the most exciting and important in my research, and one of the most difficult things in teaching. I think it's the level of responsibility that we feel as educators to make sure everything's going okay. And actually some kinds of accidents in a hybrid or a fusion or a blended classroom are really, really bad because they take away some people's access to the learning space. But some kinds of accidents and unanticipated things are actually really generative and fruitful. And so one of the things that's really important in the paper that we wrote and in our thinking about this is that it's not just about choreography. It's not just about what you do and what you plan and how you make sure that everything goes smoothly. It's also about improvisation, which we'll come on to talk about in a minute. I really think this way of framing this as productive aspects of failure, as Gilpin does here, is extremely relevant and important for the kind of work that we're trying to do here. We may no longer want to know what succeeds, but rather how else failure could function. These kinds of accidents offer up previously unanticipated possibilities and point to the enabling and productive nature of movement systems. And the story that I want to tell about this is from my elective course at the Edinburgh Futures Institute, which is Culture, Heritage and Learning Futures. And the first time this course ran in 2022, it was still very much a time when a lot of people were experiencing kind of frequent illnesses because of COVID. Everyone was still trying to grapple with how to keep each other and themselves sort of safe in in-person settings, having had lots of time when people couldn't be together in person. And there was just an absolute sense that although we had these rules about what was supposed to happen with the EFI classroom, and that those students who were on-campus students were supposed to be in the on-campus classroom when the elective intensive days were happening, that was the rule, but the reality was something different. And so I experienced something when I taught this class for the first time, which was really interesting because people were appearing and disappearing from the physical classroom and the online classroom in totally, unplanned ways. Someone was unwell the first day and then they felt better the second day. Someone needed to go and do something and an appointment, so they logged in from home. And this made something happen that I'm still kind of grappling with, and not entirely, this is still a hunch, but I think what it did was, and what it still continues to do, was to begin to sort of break down some conceptual boundaries between being an online student and being an on-campus student, particularly for those who are normally on campus. The experience of seeing the classroom in a different way, from a different perspective, of moving back and forth in that way, has, I think, done more for the sense of what we're trying to do with hybrid infusion than lots of the things that we've sort of done on purpose and tried to do. It's that sense that someone might pop up on the screen who was there this morning, and that's actually generative and really useful and really interesting. So I don't know. I think there's something that goes on when the unanticipated things happen, that if you can work with them and think about them and spend some time kind of puzzling over them, might generate some new possibilities for us. And this is very useful and helpful in teaching as well as in research.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, so really just to kind of pick up on that point about improvisation, I think the last theme is really about how to put yourself in position to improvise and to take advantage of these accidents, or to cope with the less fortunate accidents. And something I think I've learned as a teaching assistant and now supporting teaching assistants and course organizers is the importance of improvisation, but the importance of kind of training and knowledge and experience to being able to improvise. And I think that's something the dance literature makes really clear, is improvisation isn't about kind of making it up as you go. You received extensive and deep training in improvisation before you learn to choreograph. And I think the same is true for hybrid teaching. You really need to understand the kind of technical setup of the hybrid classroom, what the course is about and what the course is trying to do. You need to have a kind of rapport and good communication between the teaching team and with students in order to be able to improvise, either in response to a kind of glitch or something you need to make up for, or in more creatively and more generatively, as Jen was just pointing at. So training is really important in this, but one thing I've found is that training isn't enough. You really need to do it. There's so much going on, and I think it is a particularly kind of embodied and experiential form of knowledge required for this kind of teaching. So yes, you need to do the training, but you also just need to practice, and you need to do it in order to be able to understand how this all fits together. So there's, yeah, as we've said in the paper, the ability of the teaching assistant to improvise comes partly through attending training within a hybrid classroom, but a vital part of their knowledge also comes through experiences of working in the hybrid classroom during teaching. There are important differences between rehearsing configurations of technology in the controlled setting of the training session and navigating more pressurized live teaching where agency is negotiated with students and emergent learning activity. And I think Jen said in the chat, the first rule of online teaching and hybrid teaching is don't panic. And I think, yeah, so that as a teaching assistant, you encounter all sorts of, instances where you need to improvise to work around some kind of technical issue. One of the microphones isn't working, you drop connection in one of the devices, something like that. So there's a fair amount of that improvisation that goes on. But I wanted to share a story that talks about a more, a more kind of creative and generative form of improvisation that happened in James's class. So as we mentioned, there's a lot of group work in EFI courses. So in these intensive days, students will go into groups, often hybrid groups where there's students at a table in the room and they're connecting through a breakout room in Teams with students online. In the first couple of times we ran the course, the normal practice would be to kind of students would be in the group, then we'd say, okay, come back in 5 minutes or whatever. Everyone would come back into the main meeting, and then we'd do a kind of feedback session where, we'd have groups either share some of their thoughts or present some of their work in the whole group. And one thing we found was it was difficult to kind of focus on the students who were speaking in any way, because the audience cameras often don't show individuals very well. They just show like a part of the room. And we didn't always want to have students come up front and present because that felt a bit too formal. So the idea that we came up with together was to draw on James's research with architecture classes and the practice of crits. And James may want to say a bit more about this. But yeah, so as I said, this was the third time we ran the course, and we decided to, rather than having everyone come back into the main meeting and have a class discussion like that, we asked the students to move from table to table and the online students to move from breakout room to breakout room, and manage it so we could all stand around a table and have a chat. The students who were the kind of focus of that session would be on the screen or at the table, surrounded by the group. And we thought it just provided a nicer way of giving feedback. It was kind of I don't know. James can say about it a little bit about it, a bit more about it. Sorry, but I think what I hope this vignette demonstrates is the importance of kind of knowledge and experience to being able to realize that kind of creative form of improvisation. So as I said, it was our third time running the course together. By that time, we had a deep understanding of the technological setup in the classroom and the capabilities. James drew on his academic expertise in learning spaces from his previous research, and we had by that point built up a good rapport between ourselves and the students, good communication and trust to be able to kind of try something new in a live setting.
Okay, so coming on to conclude before we move on to some questions. Yeah, I mean, this example, and actually others I think we've shown, has been really interesting because there's a degree of unpredictability, I think, with hybrid that I wouldn't normally experience in my online teaching or in my conventional in-room teaching. I mean, education's often messy, teaching's unpredictable, but hybrid, I think, can amplify that. But it also creates new opportunities as well. And we do see unexpected things, but as Jen's talked about in terms of like the possibilities of accidents, sometimes they're really, really positive. And in this example here, and on other occasions, we found that in-room students were choosing to attend online. And what was really interesting for us was at that point, when everyone in the whole room is in the same mirror board space and they're in the same space as those online, and when we can physically see a student in the classroom and also on screen, it becomes much harder to distinguish between online and in-room. And that, for me, is a good idea of successful fusion, because you're now really focusing on the student, the learning, the high quality experience, not upon a kind of almost artificial designation of whether someone is in room or online. So to move on to conclude what we want to talk about today, we've talked about complexity and uncertainty and how we've confronted that through approaches from dance choreography. Not all aspects of dance choreography transfer so easily over to hybrid teaching. I've talked already about the fact that, understandably, dance choreography privileges the human body, and we see instead more sociomaterial entanglements of human and non-human agents. For the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, within dance, the choreographer and the performer are separate, whereas within our conceptualization, the choreographer, the teacher, is also the performer. We also don't see there as being an audience. We don't talk about student audience because very much in our teaching, students are actively involved in the activities. Audience to us suggests being a step removed, being passive, whereas the way we teach tends to very much involve students. So it's not that every single aspect of choreography lends itself to thinking about hybrid teaching, but we have found it productive to draw on some different ideas. What I should also do to qualify things is to say that even with the most careful planning and preparation, it doesn't always work any more than classroom teaching always works or online teaching always works. Things can get thrown up that you don't expect. We were originally planning to end the presentation with a slide with some of my, if you like, field notes, my recordings from this year of some technological challenges I've had. And we decided not to do that, partly through time. But one of the challenges we faced this semester was that, how can I put this? Someone in California pushed a button which created a new software update, which meant that our team's device or our team's devices around the room suddenly lost their buttons, which meant a student in Singapore couldn't connect with a student in Edinburgh and have a conversation with a student in New York. There are limited things that we can do to control what's happening in Microsoft's planning. However, the point remains that with rehearsal, with the choreography, with the planning, we're much better able to respond to some of the challenges. We've talked a lot about the challenges of hybrid teaching today and its complexities, but Jen earlier on talked about its importance and its potentialities. And probably a big point for me to end on is, as someone who advocates hybrid teaching, colleagues will sometimes ask, when it's so much harder, wouldn't it just be easier to have separate modes or just do conventional in-room teaching? From my point of view, one of the strongest arguments in favor of hybrid teaching, and I see this every single time I teach, is that there are students who simply don't have the situation or the conditions or the resources to be physically in Edinburgh. If I wasn't teaching in hybrid, I would lose these amazing students, brilliant students who are very often involved in full-time employment in different parts of the world. The expertise, the insights they bring in to the classroom make for a much, much richer experience that wouldn't be possible if we weren't attempting hybrid. So there are strategic advantages, but for me as a teacher, hybrid can lead to really inspiring, exciting teaching. That's why I and our colleagues here would advocate for it.